Yeah. Stephen A. Smith, Ryan Rucco with you on the all-new ESPN New York 98.7 FM. Dan Rafael does a great job. You read him on ESPN.com covering boxing, and he had quite the controversial night on Saturday. Dan, I know from reading your tweets you've gone back and watched the fight. Is there any way to justify how on earth Manny Pacquiao was not awarded the winner of this fight against Bradley?
One-word answer, no. I can expound.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Go ahead and expound.
You could put a 6-year-old in front of the television and ask him to score the fight. And I don't know how you could come up with 7 rounds to give to Timothy Bradley, who showed a lot of heart, was real game, came to fight, made it, the thing that's lost in all this controversy is that it was a good fight to watch. I mean, it was one-sided in my opinion, but it was a good fight. It was entertaining. You got your money's worth because they put on a good show. But the hard punches, the clean punches, the shots that did damage, remember, we're professional boxing, not amateur boxing. It's about doing damage, and that's what Pacquiao did. Visibly rocked Bradley on a number of occasions in the fight. That has to count more than the lesser impact punches that Bradley landed. So to me, and this was consistent, certainly through the first half of the fight, no question about it, Pacquiao had to be up at least, in my mind, 5 rounds to 1. And then Bradley, if you're going to give him any rounds, give him a couple of rounds, maybe 3 rounds at the most towards the end of the fight because Pacquiao was slowing down a little bit, but still doing some damage. The straight left hand was working for him beautiful the whole fight. And so maybe you could find 2 or 3 rounds to give to Tim Bradley. And so if you came up with a scorecard that was like 9-3, if you really wanted to be generous, maybe 8-4. But I find zero way you can possibly and literally and legitimately have 7 rounds to 5 in favor of Timothy Bradley like 2 of the scoring judges had it.
Dan, anyway, this has been we heard rumors, and we don't know whether or not it's been confirmed or not, that after the fight, Bob Arum or somebody walked up to Timothy Bradley and he said, I did all I could. I just couldn't beat him.
Stephen, that was a quote that was in my story. And Bob Arum came to press row. I was sitting in row 1. He looked down. He said that exact quote to myself and to others that were sitting in front of us. I typed that into my laptop. That went into my story. That's exactly what Bob stated after the fight. Just 3 or 4 minutes after they got out of the ring, and that was the quote that was attributed to Bob.
Well, echo the quote again. He said what? Timothy Bradley said what to Bob Arum?
He said that I did the best. I'm paraphrasing the quote, that I had done everything I could do. I just couldn't beat the guy. In other words, Timothy Bradley, who's an honest fighter, who's a very good fighter, top champion in the 140-pound weight class, undefeated, fought a lot of good fighters. He apparently knew that he had not won the fight. And if you look at the body language, the team lifted him up on their shoulders, I guess, after the fight. I watched the tape of that. But, you could tell by body language. He didn't win the fight. I mean, fighters know when they win, especially, if it's a close fight, it can go either way, fine. This was not one of those cases. This is one of those cases where, it was a one-sided fight for the most part. And I've been hearing from a lot of boxing fans saying, well, Pacquiao deserved it. What goes around comes around, because they're still ticked off that he got the decision against Marquez in November, and maybe even in the other fights that he had with Marquez, where one was a draw and the other one he also got the victory in. What I try to say to them is, this is not a Marquez situation. A Marquez situation is where you can have reasonable people debate the outcome of a fight because there was a number of extremely close rounds, and maybe you have it 7-5 one way, maybe you have it a draw. That was the kind of fight that happened in November in Pacquiao and Marquez, where a lot of people saw it one way or the other. Now, granted, probably more people had it for Marquez than for Pacquiao. I personally had that particular fight a draw, but there were still plenty of guys that had it on both sides and close. In the case of the Bradley and Pacquiao fight, you're talking like most people having it very clearly lopsided for one guy, not considered a quote-unquote close fight that you could debate about.
Dan Rafael does a great job covering boxing for us at ESPN.com. Here with Stephen A. Smith and Ryan Rucco on the all-new ESPN New York 98.7 FM. Dan, do you think that there will be negative long-term ramifications for boxing because of what happened on Saturday night? And because, if we want to just go based on Twitter reactions, you have athletes saying, Darren Williams tweeting out, I'm done with this sport. I was talking to CC Sabathia about it yesterday, who's a huge boxing fan. I'm never watching again, never paying for anything again.
Blah, blah, blah.
Do you buy any of it or no?
I don't buy any of that stuff because I've heard it all before. This happens every time there's some kind of outrageous decision. It's not the first time there's been a questionable decision in a fight that involved a big superstar. We could talk about, for example, Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield. There was no bigger fight going in boxing at that time when they met for the undisputed championship in the heavyweight division. And after that ridiculous draw that Lennox Lewis got saddled with when he should have gotten the victory in the undisputed title, This was the same exact situation. People were calling for national investigations, and people were never going to watch boxing again, and blah, blah, blah. And guess what? They did a rematch, and it did humongous business, and boxing, continued on.
Yeah, but
they will do the same thing in this case.
But Dan, let me be the devil's advocate here. I totally agree with you, and I'm a big-time boxing fan. You know that. But here's the deal. Timothy Bradley doesn't have a lot of punching power. He certainly wasn't considered box office, even though we know he's tough as nails, he's to be respected and all of that other stuff. He wasn't necessarily box office. And on top of it all, the quality, the cachet of boxing has been dissipating, diminishing year after year after year. So when you combine that with the fact that you still can't get the fight that you want.
See, you are wrong about that, Stephen A.
What am I wrong, sir?
You're wrong
Please
on a couple
educate
of
me.
points. Number one,
sure.
Boxing is a worldwide sport. Now, if you want to talk about it in the United States.
I'm in America. Okay. Dan. I'm sorry. I'm only talking about America. Go ahead.
Because I was going to say, in Europe and places like that, I was just recently in Nottingham, England, 2 weeks ago for Carl Froch and Lucien Boutte, a super middleweight championship fight.
Yeah.
That was one of the most electric atmospheres, and an absolutely jam-packed standing room only crowd, and a terrific fight that was an unbelievable success, and everybody loved it. It was a great, great event. And that happens around the world. But in the United States, since Pacquiao and Mayweather have become into the new level of their superstardom with drawing pay-per-view, the numbers on pay-per-view have grown. You have the gate numbers and the pay-per-view numbers in a lot of the more recent big-time fights are entering those top 5, top 10 level in terms of money generated compared to any other fights in the history of pay-per-view. So you can't tell me that it's diminishing because the numbers are just radically larger. Multiple million pay-per-view fights a year now with these guys, more so than it ever was before. And the same goes for the gates, for the number of dollars generated by the ticket sales. Somebody's buying this. Somebody's watching it.
Listen, you know better than me, and I stand corrected. But let me ask you this question. As a guy that covers the sport of boxing, when you see that we don't get the fights that we want when we want them, and a decision like this brings a black mark upon boxing, and then you have boxing gurus like the Teddy Atlases of the world and others talking about corruption, how things need to be investigated, how these are the kind of things that further sully the sport and diminishes its popularity, clearly oblivious to the facts that you just brought out, that you just explained to me.
But hold on, I don't know anybody besides Teddy who's talking about corruption in this situation, or general corruption in the sport.
No. Well, everybody, when the word corruption, we could use it. It might be a bit too strong, but we definitely feel like it was a bogus decision. I guess words, whatever adjective you want to use. I guess what I'm saying to you, Dan, and I'm asking the question here, is that in light of that reality, how do you feel as somebody who covers this sport when you've got to wait Lord knows how many years to see the elite fights that you want to see when you know it's a couple or three or a few promoters controlling the sport?
But you're talking about one fight, okay? You're talking about Mayweather-Pacquiao, and I'm as irritated as anybody because it disrupts my life for 3 years every time something happens and got to run to the computer and write a story about it. I want to see that fight happen as much as anybody, both from the point of view as being a working journalist in the medium as well as a big, huge boxing fan from many years of my life. But once again, that's a misconception to the general public. If you look at the sport of boxing, for the most part, the fights that fans want to see generally eventually do happen. There's not that many fights that you can think of in recent times that the public demanded that didn't happen. This is the only one in a long time.
Well, let me say this to you, Dan. I'm sorry because I know my man Ryan wants to get in there too.
I'm enjoying this.
Listen, I respect Dan's work and I know how passionate he is about the sport. I'm not knocking that. What I'm saying, Dan, is that here's the part that we have to own up to. Is it possible that because those promoters control the sport the way that they do, some of the fights that, like you say, we might get some of the fights we want to see, but how the hell do we know what we want to see? When you got everybody controlling what fights take place, who fights when, who fights who and when, and et cetera, and we got to wait forever to see the fights that we want to see. All we can go by is what they tell us.
Boxing has always been a sport where you had various entities that control different fighters.
But I'm asking you, does that not bother you, Dan? That was the origin of my original question.
That's capitalism. I mean, you take a look like UFC, they have the benefit, they control probably 90% of the elite mixed martial arts fighters under one promotional banner. It's a lot easier for them to make the fights. Granted, I understand that. But I also understand, the animalistic ways of business in America. Each company controls their own guys. They're looking to try to make the best deal. And most of the time, in the sport of boxing, those deals ultimately do get made.
Okay.
I guess, Dan, before we let you, I guess the difference though would be it's one thing if you want to see Pacquiao Bradley and eventually you get it. It's one thing if you want to see Mayweather Cotto and you do eventually get it. But it seems like just such an absurd, egregious oversight for it to be those two huge superstars and to never get it.
I agree with that. I mean, we can be on the same page with that. But Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather fighting each other does not represent the entirety of the sport. To some people in the mainstream, that's the only thing they know. My mother knows Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather. She doesn't know necessarily the other fighters. Boxing fans who follow the sport, who love the sport, they know all the other different fighters, or at least the best fighters. And so one fight does not make the whole sport.
That's fair.
I'm not going to be held hostage by the fact that Pacquiao and Mayweather are not fighting each other. There are plenty of other good matchups to go around.
But that's fair. That's entirely fair. But I guess what I'm saying is, if you build in the process of building up the sport, you sell us on these are the two fighters that you want to see. And we keep getting held up, and everything under the sun is allowed to prevent this from happening. And then we see something like you just pointed out, Dan, like the UFC, who's positioned in place, and obviously they have the rights to most of the fighters, and clearly they're in a better position to make sure these fights happen. I guess I was asking you the question because I was hoping that you would call for a similar kind of governing body for the sport of boxing.
I'm not going to call for a similar governing body. I think it's preposterous to tell some other boxing promoters that they should give up their fights and give up their fighters just so there can be one banner. And if there's only one banner flying the flag, then the boxers, I think, ultimately get hurt because if it's a monopolistic situation, they can't go out there and shop their wares. Right now you have different promoters that battle the sign, just like in Major League Baseball for a free agent. And there is no salary cap in boxing like in the NBA or in the NFL. Guys can go out there and seek what they want, and they can maybe try to get the best deal possible.
What best deal possible? They have no representation. What kind of representation do they have, Dan, to get what they rightfully deserve? Are we going to dispute the fact that a lot of these boxers are completely exploited and abused? Are we going to dispute that?
I'll dispute that. I'm going to say there's plenty of boxers that aren't, as you just said, exploited and abused.
Oh, I know there's plenty that's not.
Sure. That's the same way
I didn't say everyone.
Any business.
I didn't say anyone. You know I'm not saying every boxer, but I'm just saying the sport itself. If you have no representation, if you're at the mercy of promoters.
Well, they have their management, they have their attorneys, and they have to make sure they surround themselves with the proper people to do their business on their behalf. You have guys like Manny Pacquiao. He's not suffering right now. He made $26 million the other night for the fight against Bradley, and he'll probably make much more depending on how well the pay-per-view does.
Hey, okay. Dan, great stuff, man. Love debating this with you. We'll talk to you again sometime soon.
We gotta have a rematch, baby.
Yeah,
I have no problem. I have no problems with that.
Exactly. I don't know who won this one.
No. He did. Listen.
It was a lot closer than Bradley Pacquiao, though.
The man does boxing for a living.
He's great at it.
He's fantastic at what he does. We just disagree on that part, but I appreciate the facts that he spewed. I love Dan. I'm always hanging with him when we're in Vegas at the fights. Got a lot of respect for him. It's just that we disagree on that premise. Don't tell me that, you know what, they've got their management teams or whatever. These are kids half the time. They're off the streets. They're looking for an opportunity. They're ready to go to war, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have representation. You easily get exploited and take advantage of. Let's not act like it's the same for them as it is for basketball, football, and baseball players and things of that nature. It is not true at all because they don't have representation the way those other guys do. They just don't.
1-800-919-3776 is the telephone number. You guys have to hear Teddy Atlas just go off on what happened Saturday night. You'll hear that next with Stephen A. Smith and Ryan Rucco on the all-new ESPN New York 98.7 FM.